The next guy in that group that is the last of the consensus top 10 picks is somebody who I am affectionately calling the Alpha Romeo Wiz, Rome
Oh, I like
Odunze. You
that.
see what I did there? You see what I did there? We just got to put the accent on the E,
Yeah, that's
and
nicely
he's
done.
that, right? I'm kind of a nicknames guy, no big deal. He's actually been getting some recent steam as the wide receiver 2 over Malik Neighbors that I've been
Yep.
seeing. And we love Rome Odunze, so him being behind Neighbors is not an indictment on him by any means. I haven't necessarily landed on him as the wide receiver 2, but I've come around to that idea and I'm okay with accepting those arguments, right? Do you think Odunze goes as the wide receiver 2 or the wide receiver 3, Wiz? And then what do you think is a little bit of a spot that he might be able to settle? Because there are a few teams in that back of the top 10 area. Even if you want to kick it a little bit outside of the top 10, I'm cool with that too.
Yeah, so look, I think the gap has probably gotten closer since, like, let's call it beginning of February, right? I think Rome's performance at the combine, and just seeing what he's able to do kind of at his size, I definitely think it's closed. I think Neighbors is still that probably firmly in that number 2, but I think the gap is smaller. When I think about, like, the teams, Trav, like, obviously the first one that comes to mind is, like, we've gone through, the team at 4 in Zona, we've gone through the Chargers at 5. So obviously the first one up is the Giants, right? And it's a team that is in dire need of, again, skill positions, right? So looking at a guy like Rome there, I'm not necessarily sure I love the landing spot from a fantasy perspective, right? Like, I think we just kind of talked about it a little bit, like talking about what Neighbors would look like there, and how he would be able to get the ball a little bit easier than maybe somebody like Rome, who does primarily win on the outside. Look, Rome's a great contested catch guy, so if Daniel Jones feels like he has to push the ball downfield and maybe put him in some jump ball situations, of course, you can kind of see, his impact there. But I do feel like, he's fighting an uphill battle, whereas, the other 2 landing spots are really conducive to kind of fantasy performance right away. So that's just kind of how I feel about the Giants spot. But the spot that I'm more intrigued about is, if he slipped to somebody like the Bears. Right? Like, if he does make it down to 9, man, and yeah, look, I know they just traded for Keenan, and they've got DJ, but the reality is, Keenan's 31. I think he's going to be a guy that's really good for Caleb Williams to help get some of those short area passes, like first downs. And obviously you have DJ Moore to push the ball down the field a little bit, but Rome feels like a fantastic succession plan for somebody like, Keenan Allen, right? Like, I think one of my comps for Rome was like, stylistically a little bit at least, is Keenan Allen, right? Like, obviously he wins down the field a little bit more, but he's a big body guy that's a really good route runner. And I would just, if you brought somebody in like Rome to kind of learn under Keenan, and as Keenan ages out, now you've got your next wide receiver 1 and 2, and really try and maximize that rookie deal that you're going to have with Caleb. I mean, I really do kind of love the fit. Maybe not necessarily for fantasy, Trav, that first year, him having to compete with DJ Moore and Keenan. But I think as we get into subsequent, like year 2 and year 3, that could just be such a good spot for Rome.
Totally. And I think what you're doing there as kind of a dynasty manager is, if he does go in that spot, look for a buying opportunity, right? Because his first year, maybe even his second year, might be a little bit tough sledding with those horses at the top of that depth chart. But if you look at Keenan Allen's aging, DJ Moore's only signed through the end of 2025. So I think the future would look bright for Rome Odunze. So I think if he does go to Chicago, just keep it on your league mates for discounting him a little bit, just because he's not going to produce early potentially. Because I think he's just such a versatile weapon. He's got a lot of size, but the versatility is nice. I put out a tweet probably a little bit early in my rookie process where only 3 wide receivers in this class had over 500 yards after the catch and an average depth of target over 12 in their final season. Troy Franklin, Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze. And I think where Rome is a little bit different than the other 2, he's 6'3", 215-ish pounds. And he's doing that kind of stuff after the catch. So we like to see that for Rome. Anywhere he lands, I think, is going to be great. But that Bears landing spot is very nice. And I think, just to touch back on that Giants one, I think what you're hoping for there is, at the very least, his floor is a solid fantasy finish, because he was a compiler and just was the only guy soaking up targets there. And then when they get some better quarterback play, maybe we see some of that ceiling on top of what he does. But I don't think that's even a death knell to his ceiling, because he
No.
would probably get peppered with targets there. So I think those are a couple good spots, and I have a hard time seeing Rome getting out of that top 10. Like, do you think any of these guys could slip?
I mean, look, when you think about like, Harmon just recently in the last few weeks, or actually like the last 10 days or so, released Rome's Perception, right? Shout out Matt Harmon, just does fantastic stuff. And first all green prospect, right? So like that right there kind of tells you, and when you look at kind of a lot of the big boards, the fact that that's the wide receiver 3 in this class really just does speak to kind of that talent at the top. Brett Whitefield, and I heard Brett Whitefield and Scott Barrett talking through Rome the other day. And again, just like there's just such high praise for a guy like that who is considered kind of that wide receiver 3 by some people. Look, you're almost like splitting hairs. It does remind me a little bit of, you go back to 2022 when you had Wilson, Olave, and London. I think a lot of people, because of, London's prospect pedigree and age at the time, but it really almost feels like you can't go wrong with any one of these guys. But yeah, I think Rome landing in a spot like Chicago is super interesting, maybe not near year one. And I think that point that you had about, look, if it ever presented a buying opportunity for a guy like Rome, be sure to jump on it, because I think, as Keenan does start to age out and he slides into that wide receiver 2 role with a guy like Caleb, who they're going to be throwing the ball quite a bit, like, and a technician like Rome is, it's a nice fantasy landing spot.